You're listening to the WaxPackHero Sports Card Minute, a podcast where we discuss both the hobby and business sides of collecting. I'm your host, Mike Summer, and I want to help you buy, sell, and trade your way into a collection you'll love. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming back to another episode of the show. Well, over the last few years, it seems that there's somewhat of a resurgence in the hobby. Sales by card manufacturers are up. Attendance at the National has been up for the last few years. I see more and more conversation online about new local shows popping up or the local shows that had been existing for a while gaining more and more attendance, and that's great. And I think that's driven by a couple different things. One is some new entrants into the hobby. Some new people are coming in that had never collected before, but there's also a lot of people who collected as a kid who are now starting to come back and collect as an adult and get their kids involved. And so that world is a lot different than it was in the past. And so I wanted to talk a little bit today about some tips for the new and returning collector. But before we get to that, I get to do one of my favorite parts of the show, and that's to give a shout out to somebody who left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Today's shout out goes to @BaseballCards, and that's cards with a K. He says, Mike has always been a great follow on Twitter and his blog. Was excited to see he was putting out a podcast, and it does not disappoint. Very knowledgeable and passionate about the hobby. Anyone who listens will learn something. Keep up the great pods. Well, thanks, @BaseballCards. I appreciate it. And if you'd like to get a shout out, you can leave a review on your podcast app of choice. I really appreciate it. I think it does help. I know I say this all the time, but I think it does help other people find the show. All right, now let's talk about a few ideas that I've been thinking about that I've got that I think are helpful whether you are a brand new collector or whether you are somebody who's returning to the hobby. The first thing is, it can be very overwhelming if you walk into a Target or a Walmart or your local hobby shop to see so many different products that are sitting on the shelves. It's just so overwhelming to see so many options priced at all different levels. You know, one of the things that I learned when I first got back in is that you can't collect everything. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, you had between 3 or 5 different options to pick from, and it's just gradually ballooned over time. And so that's one of the things that is probably a big advantage as well as the biggest distraction, is that there's so many options to choose from. For me, I decided I need to focus in on what I enjoyed the most. And that's where I think everyone needs to start to think about what do they enjoy most about the hobby and narrow your focus. For me, that's a focus on base and inserts. I love set building, and I love to have a large variety of cards of my favorite players. And so when I focus on base and insert cards, I'm able to get that wide variety of cards from my favorite players, and I'm able to put together these base sets, and it's relatively cheap and affordable. Now, other people have different focuses. You know, I know there's some people who only want graded cards, and they really like the way that graded cards look in their case and the protection that gives them, and that's what they land on. I know other people who only focus on vintage, and pretty much anything that is newer than 1980 they want no part of, and they just like to track down that vintage stuff. You know, there's Facebook groups that I'm a part of that are only focused on junk wax era cards. They don't want the really old stuff. They don't want the new stuff, but they love those things that are between 1985 and 1995, and they just buy all that as much as they can. So there's team collectors out there. There's another basketball podcast that I listen to, and that guy has like 17 cards in his entire collection. He's just narrowed down to 17 pretty high-end cards, and that is his entire collection, and he loves it. And so all that to say, don't try to collect everything. It's just going to burn you out. It's just going to be overly expensive. Try to narrow your focus on what you enjoy the most. And that's one of the great things about the hobby is it's been going on for 100 years if you go back to the old tobacco cards, and there's something for everybody. And so narrow your focus, find out what you enjoy the most, and just start to pursue that. The second thing that I want to suggest that you consider is something that we've already talked about on prior episodes, and that is to start to flip a little bit, to find some cards that you can buy and sell to raise some extra funds to help offset the cost. Cards, even if you narrow your focus, cards can be expensive, and it doesn't take too long before those card expenses can be a little bit more of your paycheck than you'd like, or maybe a little bit more of your paycheck than your significant other would prefer. And so there's so many avenues out there today that allow you to do a little bit of flipping, to do some buying and selling, and raise some extra funds to offset the cost of your hobby. Whether that's ComC, buying and selling, whether that's sport lots that we've already talked about, or eBay, or even in person on the Facebook Marketplace platform, there are ways that you can raise some extra funds to help offset the cost of the hobby. And the last thing that I think I would suggest that you consider is, I would say it takes a village, or at least a hobby shop full of collectors, or a forum full of posters to have a lot of fun. Collecting is better when we can share those experiences with others who have the same interest. And sometimes that's face-to-face, but that's also sometimes online on Twitter or Facebook groups or other things like podcasts and blog communities. I wouldn't enjoy the hobby near as much if I wasn't doing it with some other like-minded people. And like I said, sometimes there's a few local friends that I've got that we get together and talk cards, but also online. There's some great communities where you can get plugged in, you can ask questions, you can learn about the various angles of the hobby. As part of that whole narrowing your focus, you can get in and read about what people are enjoying from all of those little niches within this sports card niche that we have. And so I would suggest, especially if you're new or returning to the hobby, that you get plugged in and you reach out to some other collectors who have already learned some of those lessons and can give you some tips and ideas, because I think that will really help welcome you back, help you avoid making some mistakes that maybe some others have made along the way, and it'll just make it a more enjoyable experience overall. I guess as I think about it, while I said these are tips for the new or returning collector, there's a lot of these things I think that can be applied to experienced collectors as well. I talk with other collectors all the time, or some of my friends are dealing with feeling a little bit burned out or overwhelmed, and narrowing your focus is something that some of them have tried to do to purge some of the things in their collection that they don't like as much. And so I think that can be applicable to the experienced collector as well. Flipping and selling some cards to raise some funds, that can be applicable to everybody. And those experienced collectors can be that mentor or that great resource for new or returning collectors as well. So being part of that hobby community is something that experienced collectors should be a part of too. So that's what I have for you today. I would love to hear any additional thoughts that you've got. Leave me a note on Twitter or in the comments section of any other ideas and thoughts that you've got on how a new or returning collector can get acclimated to the hobby and start to figure this stuff out. I know those three things that I mentioned aren't the only thoughts or ideas that would be helpful for somebody. So reach out and let me know, and maybe we can all learn some more things. You can get a hold of me at @TheMikeSummer on Twitter, or you can send me an email at WaxPackHero@gmail.com, or search WaxPackHero on Facebook or Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, and I'll catch you next time.